June 8, 793, coast of Northumbria, England. The morning sun illuminates the calm waters of the North Sea when dark shadows appear on the horizon. Monks in prayer inside Lindisfarne Monastery don't know it yet, but they're about to witness the birth of a new age of terror. Do you know what really happened on the day the medieval world changed forever? The story you've been told about barbaric Viking raiders is incomplete. This wasn't just an attack. It was the first war cry of a civilization that would redraw the map of Europe. In this video, you'll discover why Lindisfarne was chosen, what the monks actually faced, and how a single day of bloodshed transformed the course of Western history. Get ready, the truth is more brutal and fascinating than any legend. If you're passionate about real history, subscribe to the channel right now. To understand the impact of Lindisfarne, we need to go back a few decades. 8th century England was a mosaic of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in constant dispute. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. Each kingdom had its king, its armies, its ambitions. But there was something that united them all: the Christian faith. Since the 6th century, when missionaries like St. Augustine and St. Aidan brought Christianity to the British Isles, monasteries spread across England. These weren't just religious centers, they were universities, libraries, centers of artistic production, and most importantly, banks. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserved classical knowledge, and accumulated wealth donated by nobles seeking to secure a place in heaven. Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, was one of these sacred places. Founded in 635 by the Irish monk St. Aidan, the island lay on the northeast coast of England, accessible by land only during low tide. It was isolated, peaceful, and incredibly wealthy. Gold reliquaries, silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts like the famous Lindisfarne Gospels. Everything stored in a virtually unprotected location. Why? Because the idea of an attack coming from the sea was unthinkable. England had grown accustomed to land wars between Christian kingdoms. Large-scale maritime attacks? That didn't exist in the military vocabulary of the time. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, a storm was forming. In Scandinavia, population explosion, scarcity of arable land, and seafaring tradition created a generation of young warriors without inheritance and with much to prove. They mastered the construction of longships, revolutionary vessels that combined speed, maneuverability in shallow waters, and design that allowed both ocean navigation and entry into rivers. These men didn't call themselves Vikings. That term would come later. They were Norse, Scandinavians, men from the north. And they were hungry for wealth, glory, and land. Reports about the riches of Christian monasteries probably reached them through merchants who sailed the Baltic and North Sea routes. Lindisfarne, with its low walls, no military garrison, and treasures accumulated over generations, was the perfect target. But there was something more. For the Norse, attacking a Christian site didn't carry the moral weight it would have for a Christianized European. They followed the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya. To them, the monastery was just a poorly guarded warehouse of riches. There was no sacrilege, only opportunity. And then, on a summer morning, opportunity knocked at the door. Picture the scene: high tide, morning fog over the North Sea. Suddenly, silhouettes emerge through the mist. 3, 4, maybe 5 longships gliding silently toward Lindisfarne's beach. The striped sails come down. Oars go into action with military precision. The keels scrape the sand. The first monks who saw the ships were probably confused. Traders? Pilgrims? Then the ship doors opened, and warriors leaped onto the beach. Tall men, long hair, braided beards, leather armor and chainmail, broad-bladed axes, swords, spears with tips gleaming in the rising sun, and circular shields painted with symbols the monks had never seen. There was no negotiation, there was no warning, only violence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written decades later, records the event with palpable horror. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the people. There were exceptional whirlwinds and lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. And soon after these signs, a great famine came upon the land, and after that, in the same year, on the 8th day of June, the devastation of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. Alcuin of York, the most respected scholar of the time and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote a devastating letter to the king of Northumbria. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments. The most venerable place in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples. The attack was swift and brutal. The monks had no weapons, no military training, nowhere to run. Some were killed immediately. Others were chained to be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets. The altar was desecrated. Reliquaries were torn from the walls. Precious manuscripts were trampled or thrown into the sea in the frenzied search for gold and silver. The attackers knew exactly what to look for. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a professional raid. They broke coffers, ripped jewels from crosses, melted liturgical objects to facilitate transport. In a few hours, they accumulated wealth equivalent to years of tribute from an entire kingdom. And then, as quickly as they arrived, they departed. The longships were loaded with treasures, slaves, and provisions. The sails went up, the oars cut through the water, and they disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind smoke, corpses, and a world in shock. News spread across England like wildfire. Letters flew between monasteries. Kings convened councils. For the first time, Christians in England realized they were vulnerable in a way they'd never imagined. The sea was no longer a protective barrier. It was a highway to destruction. But wait, it gets worse, because Lindisfarne wasn't an isolated event. The attack on Lindisfarne was the first drop of a storm that would last 3 centuries. 793 marked the official beginning of the Viking Age, a period of Scandinavian expansion that would completely redraw the political, cultural, and economic map of Europe. The following year, in 794, the attacks continued. The monastery of Jarrow, also in Northumbria, was attacked. This time, defenders were slightly more prepared, and the attackers suffered losses. But the message was clear: the men from the north would return. In 795, it was Ireland's turn. The monastery of Iona, founded by Saint Columba and one of the most important spiritual centers of Celtic Christianity, was sacked. 68 monks were massacred. The attackers returned in 802 and again in 806. On the third invasion, the abbot was killed during the carnage. These attacks followed a strategic pattern. The Vikings targeted coastal locations or those accessible by rivers, rich in portable goods and poorly defended. Monasteries were perfect targets, but not the only ones. Trading villages, prosperous agricultural settlements, even small port towns, nothing was safe. But why the intensification? Several factors combined. First, the success at Lindisfarne proved that raids were profitable and relatively safe. Second, Scandinavian naval technology continued evolving, allowing longer voyages and larger crews. Third, Norse social structure rewarded successful warriors with status, land, and political power. Young men without inheritance could become respected leaders if they returned from an expedition loaded with gold and slaves. And fourth, perhaps most important, resistance in England, Ireland, and France was fragmented and ineffective. Christian kingdoms spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. There were no standing armies capable of quickly responding to coastal attacks. By the time defenders finally organized, the Vikings were already days away, rowing back to Scandinavia. Over time, the attacks evolved. What began as summer raids transformed into overwintering campaigns. In 851, Vikings established a permanent camp at the mouth of the Thames. In 866, the great heathen army invaded England, not to plunder, but to conquer and colonize. Lindisfarne was the spark, but the fire that followed consumed generations. Entire kingdoms disappeared. Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, all fell under Scandinavian control. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, managed to resist. And even then, it was a decades-long struggle. Continental Europe also felt Norse fury. Paris was besieged multiple times. Monasteries along the Loire, Seine, and Rhine rivers were repeatedly sacked. In 845, Vikings attacked Hamburg. In 859, they sailed to the Mediterranean and plundered cities in Italy and North Africa. And it all started at Lindisfarne. A single day, a single attack, a monastery on a remote island. But the waves created that day crossed centuries. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because everything you just heard about blood, violence, and destruction is true, but it's far from the complete story. The Vikings were brutal raiders, but they were also sophisticated traders, brave explorers, talented craftsmen, and builders of complex societies. The word Viking is actually a verb in Old Norse. Fara I Viking means to go on an expedition. Not all Scandinavians were Vikings. Most were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, traders. Raids were a seasonal activity for some, a profession for few. But that noisy and violent minority dominated the historical narrative for 1,000 years. Let's deconstruct some myths. First, the famous horned helmets never existed. Not a single Viking helmet with horns has been found in archaeological excavations. That image was created by romantic 19th-century artists who wanted to make Vikings more dramatic and exotic. Real Viking helmets were conical, simple, and extremely rare. Most warriors fought without head protection, wearing only leather caps. Second myth, Vikings were dirty, primitive giants. No. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval Scandinavians were meticulous about personal hygiene. They bathed weekly, something rare in Christian Europe at the time. Tweezers, combs, ear cleaners, and razors have been found in almost all Viking sites. English chroniclers complained that Norsemen seduced Anglo-Saxon women precisely because they were clean and well-groomed. Third myth, Vikings only destroyed. False. They built Dublin, the capital of Ireland. They founded Novgorod and Kiev, cities that would become centers of the Russian state. They established trade routes connecting Constantinople to the Arctic, exchanging furs, amber, slaves, and walrus ivory for silk, spices, and Islamic silver. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus, establishing a settlement at Lons os Meadows, Newfoundland. Vikings were also artists. Norse art, with its complex interlaced patterns and stylized creatures, influenced the medieval aesthetic throughout Europe. They were poets, creating epic sagas still studied today. And they were technological innovators, especially in shipbuilding and metallurgy. But we can't romanticize too much. The violence was real. Slavery was real. The attacks caused unimaginable suffering, destroyed families, lost knowledge, annihilated communities. The Norse term for slave, thrall became a permanent part of the vocabulary of domination. The truth is that Vikings were human, complex, contradictory, products of their time and environment. They weren't more evil than the Christian armies that massacred pagan Saxons during Charlemagne's wars. They weren't crueler than the Crusaders who would come centuries later. But they also weren't the tragic, misunderstood heroes that some modern narratives try to create. They were warriors, traders, explorers, and colonizers who changed the world through force, cunning, and reckless courage. And it all began when some men, brave or crazy enough, pointed their ships west and decided to see what they'd find. Lindisfarne was the first step of that journey, a step bathed in blood. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't just a violent event. It was a turning point that reconfigured European politics, culture, and religion for centuries. Let's trace the consequences. First, change in military architecture. Before 793, most English monasteries were deliberately open and welcoming. After Lindisfarne, fortification became priority. Walls were erected, watchtowers built. Monasteries began to look like fortresses. This is the origin of many defensive medieval structures we see today. Second, political reconfiguration. Viking pressure forced fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to cooperate or die. Alfred the Great of Wessex managed to unite enough resistance to create the foundation of what would eventually become unified England. Without the Viking threat, England might have remained a mosaic of small kingdoms much longer. Third, establishment of the Danelaw. Large portions of England were conquered and colonized by Scandinavians. The Danelaw, the region under Danish law and control, left permanent marks on English language, culture, and legal structure. Hundreds of modern English words have Scandinavian origin: sky, egg, knife, window, husband. Place names ending in by, thorpe, and thwaite are Viking heritage. Fourth, religious transformation. Ironically, descendants of pagan invaders became some of the most devout Christians in Europe. Canute the Great, Viking king of England, Denmark, and Norway in the 11th century, made pilgrimage to Rome and was generous patron of the Church. The conversion of Scandinavians fully integrated the region into European Christendom. Fifth, expansion of European horizon. Vikings were the first Europeans to establish presence in the North Atlantic. They colonized Iceland, Greenland, and, temporarily, North America. These expeditions expanded medieval geographical knowledge and established precedents for the age of exploration that would come centuries later. Sixth, economic impact. Viking trade routes connected regions that previously had minimal contact. Arab silver flowed to Scandinavia through the Varangian route, passing through Russia. Irish and English slaves were sold in Mediterranean markets. This early international trade helped establish the foundations of the medieval commercial economy. Seventh, change in military thinking. Europeans had to rethink defensive strategy. The idea that the sea could be an avenue of attack, not just a protective barrier, transformed military planning. Naval fleets became priorities. Early warning systems were developed. Mobility became as important as fortification. Lindisfarne also had profound psychological impact. The violation of a sacred site by pagans was interpreted by many Christian clerics as divine punishment for society's sins. Alcuin of York wrote extensively about this, arguing that lust, greed, and pride among Christians had provoked God's wrath, who sent pagans as a scourge. This theological interpretation had lasting consequences. Monastic reforms were initiated. The concept of spiritual battle against pagan forces was reinforced, foreshadowing ideologies that would culminate in the Crusades centuries later. Finally, Lindisfarne entered cultural mythology. The event became a symbol of the confrontation between Christian civilization and pagan barbarism, a landmark dividing historical periods. For the English, it's a defining moment of national identity. For Scandinavians, it marks the beginning of their expansion into world history. A single day, a few hours of violence, but the echo crossed centuries. So what really happened at Lindisfarne on June 8, 793? It wasn't just an attack. It was the brutal announcement of a new era. The world the monks knew, where monasteries were untouchable sanctuaries and the sea was a safe barrier, died that day. A new world was born, where borders were fluid, where maritime warriors could appear without warning, and where no place was truly safe. Lindisfarne was the first chapter of an epic story that would last 300 years. Vikings would completely transform Europe. They founded kingdoms, established cities, created trade routes that connected continents. They forced fragmented peoples to unite into nations. And eventually, they were absorbed by the cultures they attacked, leaving genetic, linguistic, and cultural legacy that persists today. But it all started with those first ships emerging from the morning mist, with the first war cry echoing through the monastery stones, with the first blood spilled on the beach of a sacred island. History teaches us that change is rarely gentle. It arrives in ships, carrying axes and shields, breaking what we thought was permanent. Lindisfarne was one of those moments. A moment when the old world ended and a new one, more violent, more connected, more unpredictable, began. And if you look at the world today, you'll see that lesson still resonates. Borders that seem fixed aren't. Cultures that seem separate meet and blend. History doesn't end. It just changes form. If this video made you see medieval history differently, leave your like. If you want more stories that reveal what really happened behind myths and legends, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Comment below which historical event you want me to explore next. And remember, real history is always more fascinating than any fiction. See you in the next video. Until then, keep exploring the past to understand the present.